Ethan had been fascinated by lighthouses since childhood. Growing up in a small fishing village along the English coast, he spent hours gazing out at the distant lighthouses standing vigilantly over the rocky shoals. He imagined the brave, solitary men inside, ensuring that others came home safe. Now 42, Ethan never lost his childhood wonder at the lighthouse's lonely beauty. Over the years he had learned their origins and histories, how they evolved into automated sentinels, guided more by machines than men. Though many remained, their heroic human keepers were gone, replaced by modern technology. When Ethan saw the posting for a lighthouse keeper position at remote Flintwood Lighthouse, it felt like destiny calling. Constructed in 1822, Flintwood loomed tall and imposing over treacherous cliffs far from any towns or ports. Long automated, it still required a caretaker to maintain the facilities and grounds. The solitude and responsibility were appealing to Ethan. After submitting his application, Ethan was thrilled to receive word that he had been selected as Flintwood's new keeper. The board offered him room and board and a small stipend, though they stressed that everyday upkeep would be his primary duty. Isolated and exposed, the lighthouse was notorious for weathering damage. Upon arriving in late April, Ethan was immediately struck by the primordial presence of the lighthouse. Granite boulders surrounded its base, lashed by violent waves. Inside he found a basic living area and kitchen, along with an iron spiral staircase winding endlessly upwards through Flintwood's core. Ominous shadows clung to the rocky walls. This was worlds away from Ethan's cozy coastal village. At the top of the stairs stood the magnificent lantern room encased in glass, housing the enormous beaming lens. During the day, seagulls could peer in like spectators at some celestial event. Ethan happily fell into a daily routine caring for his new home, finding beauty in the simple, repetitive tasks. The dream was now reality. As spring gave way to summer, Ethan settled into his solitary life tending Flintwood. The days brought rewarding work, but the long midsummer nights weighed heavily. Lying awake listening to the churning waves and shrieking gulls, Ethan felt the aura of loneliness that pervaded the place like a disembodied entity. Seeking to further connect with Flintwood's history, Ethan began sifting through the remaining lighthouse logs and journals of former keepers in the cluttered storerooms. Their routine accounts of maintenance and deliveries concealed deeper insights into days and nights the men spent confined in the tower with only the sea and stars as companions. Tales of madness, obsession, and despair lay hidden within those pages. Restoring the crumbling documents and artifacts became a passion for Ethan. He displayed his expanding collection throughout the living quarters, imagining it brought him closer to the long line of devoted men who came before him. They were kindred spirits, embodying the loyalty and tireless diligence symbolized by the ever-burning beacon that guided others to safety. Ethan hoped their noble spirit might rub off on him. The remainder of summer passed swiftly, though Ethan occasionally detected odd incidents he chalked up to his overactive imagination. A passing shadow detected out of the corner of his eye. The distant sound of footsteps on a supposedly empty staircase. A whisper in the dark that vanished when he strained to listen. Lighthouses were notorious for their ghost stories and legends that Ethan always dismissed. Sunset's shifting light and fog banks carried sound and shadows oddly. But as autumn gales began to lash the coast, the anomalies grew bolder. Ethan's sleep became increasingly disturbed by scraping noises that echoed from unseen corners of the tower at night. His carefully organized documents were found scattered across the floor one morning. The great winding motors powering the lantern mechanism seemed to sputter and fail for no reason on certain nights. Standing in the lantern room observing the oscillating light sweep through the darkness, Ethan peered out into the hungry night. For a moment he sensed a presence standing there. A man transfixed by the beacon, as Ethan was. But when he turned, no one was there. Where the shadows gathered at each revolution of the lens, they almost resembled figures. Ethan descended the winding staircase, shaken by the encounter. Gusts of frigid ocean air swirled up from the depths as if the very stones were breathing. Reaching the living quarters, he lit the kerosene lamps with trembling fingers. The hissing flames seemed to fill the room with disembodied shadows. Sitting at the solid wooden table, Ethan tried calming himself by examining his collection of lighthouse artifacts. The tarnished brass oil lamp engraved with initials. The logbook filled with spidery script recounting storms and shipwrecks. The cracked glass lens from the original beacon. Each object tied him to the shared history of Flintwood. As Ethan studied a compass plaque dedicating the lighthouse to lives lost at sea, he noticed a smudged entry in the current log he didn't remember writing. "It knows me." The words chilled him, though they echoed his own growing fear. Over the next few days, Ethan deliberately avoided the lantern room, spending his time maintaining the exterior instead. But each night Flintwood called to him. He lay awake listening to the resonance of the rotating lens overhead, the intermittent moaning of wind animating the tower, and occasionally, the heavy tread of footsteps on the iron stairs. On the third night, Ethan surrendered to the summons. Lamp in hand, he slowly climbed past shadowy doorways, emerging into the lantern room. The light blazed, reflecting off every mote of dust. Ethan cautiously leaned over the railing, gazing downward into the abyss where the steps spiraled into darkness. A shapeless mass of blackness lurked below. As Ethan watched, something began ascending from the depths. It moved in lurching steps, dragging chains that clanked against the metal stairs. The mass coalesced into a human shape, and a face stared up at Ethan. Hollow eyes met his, and a silent scream contorted the ghostly figure's features. Ethan descended the winding staircase, shaken by the encounter. Gusts of frigid ocean air swirled up from the depths as if the very stones were breathing. Reaching the living quarters, he lit the kerosene lamps with trembling fingers. The hissing flames seemed to fill the room with disembodied shadows. Sitting at the solid wooden table, Ethan tried calming himself by examining his collection of lighthouse artifacts. The tarnished brass oil lamp engraved with initials. The logbook filled with spidery script recounting storms and shipwrecks. The cracked glass lens from the original beacon. Each object tied him to the shared history of Flintwood. As Ethan studied a compass plaque dedicating the lighthouse to lives lost at sea, he noticed a smudged entry in the current log he didn't remember writing. "It knows me." The words chilled him, though they echoed his own growing fear. Over the next few days, Ethan deliberately avoided the lantern room, spending his time maintaining the exterior instead. But each night Flintwood called to him. He lay awake listening to the resonance of the rotating lens overhead, the intermittent moaning of wind animating the tower, and occasionally, the heavy tread of footsteps on the iron stairs. On the third night, Ethan surrendered to the summons. Lamp in hand, he slowly climbed past shadowy doorways, emerging into the lantern room. The light blazed, reflecting off every mote of dust. Ethan cautiously leaned over the railing, gazing downward into the abyss where the steps spiraled into darkness. A shapeless mass of blackness lurked below. As Ethan watched, something began ascending from the depths. It moved in lurching steps, dragging chains that clanked against the metal stairs. The mass coalesced into a human shape, and a face stared up at Ethan. Hollow eyes met his, and a silent scream contorted the ghostly figure's features. Ethan stumbled back, nearly dropping his lamp. The apparition continued its tortured ascent, compelled by some unseen force to repeat this. Ethan knew then that the former keeper was trapped, doomed to haunt Flintwood eternally. Fleeing the spectacle, Ethan rushed headlong down the steps, feeling the cold radiating from below as the ghost pursued him. He heaved at doors, finding only more stairs and passages winding deeper into the tower in an impossible maze. There was no escape from its labyrinth. Flintwood had laid claim to Ethan, as it had the others before. Whether days or years passed, he was lost in its eternity now. Ethan wandered the endless stairways and chambers of the tower, lost in both direction and time. He no longer knew whether it was day or night in the outside world. Flintwood had become his entire reality. Exhausted, he slumped against the curving walls of the stairwell. The stone chilled him to his core. Looking up, Ethan saw the steps spiraling infinitely upwards into shadows. But when he gazed down, there was only blackness. No light reached this deep in the well. Ethan's oil lamp flickered weakly as if draining along with his own life force. He feared what lurked in the depths below but had no choice but to descend. Arms outstretched, he groped his way blindly down the stairs. The blackness seemed to constrict around him. Emerging into a subterranean hall, Ethan raised the lamp with trembling hands. The corridor was lined with doors that had not seen use in a century. Steeling himself, Ethan walked the length of the hall, testing each in turn. The doors rattled in their frames but would not give. At the end of the passage loomed an imposing set of double doors bound in tarnished metal bands. As Ethan reached for the handle, the lamp suddenly died, plunging him into absolute darkness. From behind the door came heavy scraping and dragging noises like chains being pulled across stone. Ethan stood paralyzed, his blood turned to ice. Frantically, Ethan beat against the doors, desperate to escape the sounds drawing nearer in blackness. With a groan of ancient hinges, the doors reluctantly swung inward. Ethan fell through into damp, stale air smelling of earth. Raising a feeble flame with his matches, he found himself in a cavernous chamber with a vaulted ceiling that extended beyond his light's reach. The noises had ceased, but Ethan knew he was not alone here. Not daring to move, he waited in the chilling silence. A faint shimmer slowly illuminated the room's distant recesses, though no source was visible. As the light intensified, Ethan saw human forms materializing, their spectral features becoming clearer. A dozen lost souls stood watching Ethan, transfixed. Their visages were weary and full of sorrow. But their collective gaze was firm with resolve. Ethan understood what bound these specters here. Flintwood's inexorable beacon had been their calling in life, and remained so in death. They were now as eternal as the stones themselves. No force of nature could sway them from their duty. These were his lighthouse brethren, extinguished but undimmed. Their vigil would never cease. And now Ethan realized his place here among them. Once chosen, there was no escape. Ethan had merely crossed the threshold from one realm to the next. Flintwood awaited its newest keeper. Surrounded by the lost souls of Flintwood, Ethan oddly felt no fear. Their stoic resolve resonated within him, erasing all doubt. He had found his calling here among the timeless stones and sea. One spirit, his worn uniform dating him to the 1800s, extended a shimmering hand toward Ethan, beckoning him to join their ceaseless vigil. To become one with the lighthouse and its sacred duty forevermore. Ethan stepped forward to meet his new brethren. As he reached for the ghostly keeper's hand, a deafening crack resounded through the cavern. Stone fragments rained down as a giant fissure opened in the ceiling, widening by the second. The spirits flickered and faded as blinding sunlight streamed into the chamber. Shielding his eyes, Ethan glimpsed vast blue sky above where the roof had ruptured. The walls groaned under the strain. This place was disintegrating. Ethan clambered over debris and hoisted himself out through the gaping crevice. He staggered forward onto spongy grass, inhaling sweet sea air. Turning back in disbelief, he saw no trace of Flintwood Lighthouse. Only green hills sweeping gently down to the cliff's edge. Had he dreamed it all? Ethan struggled to reconcile the living landscape before him with the nightmare realm he had inhabited. He desperately clutched the remaining fragments, his oil lamp, logbook, and other artifacts he had safeguarded. These were his only tether to that fading reality. In shock, Ethan aimlessly wandered the headlands for hours as dusk gathered. In the distance, he spotted a tiny fishing village nestled in the cove that had not been there before. His heart swelled at the sight of life and light glowing warmly across the water. Finally, Ethan's strength gave out and he collapsed to his knees, overcome with emotion. The spirits of Flintwood were gone, returned to the tides and time that bore them. And Ethan was free. He wept under the emerging stars until he could weep no more. Dawn's rosy glow found him still curled in the grass, finally at peace. Today he would begin his new life in this place he had never seen but somehow felt destined to find. Ethan gazed out at the calm sea and smiled inwardly. Flintwood had guided him home. As Ethan watched in horror from the cliffs, Flintwood Lighthouse emerged from the Black Sea as if resurrected. Its lantern sliced through the darkness like an all-seeing eye. Ethan recalled the first time he glimpsed that beacon, so full of wonder and promise. Now it filled him with dread. Randall Gray had disturbed something that was better left forgotten. Ethan hurried to the harbor as swirling mists enveloped the village, driven by an occult wind. Villagers barricaded themselves indoors against the malevolent forces encroaching through the night. At the docks, Ethan boarded a small motorized skiff, the only vessel left unmoored. He knew what had to be done. The mysteries of Flintwood had to remain buried beneath the waves forever, even if that meant he did too. As Ethan approached across the black water, the lighthouse tower appeared unchanged, still solid and defiant against time and the elements. The stones glisten with seawater as if freshly raised from the depths. No beacon shone to warn ships away. Only darkness dwelled here now. Ethan tied up and entered through an open doorway at the base of the tower. Inside he found no furnishings, only the familiar spiral staircase winding up into the empty heart of Flintwood. Taking a deep breath, Ethan began his ascent. The metal stairs groaned under his steps. Pausing, he looked over the railing into the abyssal shaft below. Through the blackness, Ethan saw faint wisps of ectoplasm rising. The spirits sensed his presence and would soon come for him. Arriving in the cavernous chamber housing the lantern, Ethan froze. The glass that once surrounded the space had vanished. Standing at the railing, gazing out over the churning sea, stood two figures. One was Randall Gray. The other slowly turned to face Ethan. The phantom's hollow eyes and gaunt features were those of the very first keeper of Flintwood from centuries ago. The tortured spirit Ethan had seen dragged its chains through the purgatory of the lighthouse for all time. Until now. Gray had discovered rituals to bind the ghost to his will and awaken Flintwood once more. The old keeper approached Ethan, compelled by his new master. Gray shouted above the wind that Ethan too would now obey, revealing his cherished secrets of the lighthouse. Backing away, Ethan knew Gray had to be stopped, whatever the sacrifice required. The spirit's suffering at this man's hands had to end. As the possessed phantom neared, Ethan glanced behind him at the surging sea below. Meeting the keeper's dead gaze, Ethan smiled sadly. Without hesitation, Ethan leapt over the railing, plunging into the frigid waters as Gray screamed in rage. Icy blackness embraced Ethan, indifferent and profound. Deeper he sank into the timeless depths as Flintwood faded into the consuming fog above. No past or future, only the silence. Ethan had come home, and the light welcomed him below. Gray watched in stunned disbelief as Ethan leapt to his apparent demise in the churning sea below. His vengeance had ultimately been thwarted by the keeper's selfless act. With Ethan gone, the bound spirit of the first keeper was released from Gray's control. Freed of its torment, the phantom dissipated into mist on the wind. The remaining ghosts of Flintwood's past followed, their long-trapped essences finally allowed to journey beyond this mortal plane. The lighthouse trembled from its very foundations. Cracks spread across the walls and ceiling like fractured ice. Gray scrambled down the deteriorating steps as the tower collapsed floor by floor in a deafening crescendo behind him. Stumbling onto the rocky shore, Gray beheld the last remnants of mighty Flintwood sinking below the waves. Its secrets were now buried forever, beyond the reach of living souls. The swirling mists slowly dissipated, revealing dawn's light creeping over the horizon. In the coming days, Gray was found ravaged by fever and close to death in a nearby coastal hamlet. Until his last breath, he ranted of cursed lighthouses and vengeful spirits. No one paid his wild tales any mind. Meanwhile, Ethan's selfless sacrifice became woven into local lore. On clear nights, some claim a faint comet-like glow can be seen far out to sea in the spot where Flintwood Lighthouse had once stood. A lingering ghost light, or perhaps a peaceful spirit finally unmoored. Ethan was never found, but the village erected a memorial plaque honoring him and the keepers who came before. Their devotion and courage would be remembered, a guiding light in darker times. One that still brings hope to those who heed its call across the waves.